Just quiet. That's what it was. Blank expressions. Of course, they were scared. They've never endured anything like that before. They didn't know where they were going. You know, bugs get on the children and stuff, and they scratch and they bite and all that stuff. So their condition wasn't the greatest.
That is Captain Jeremiah Griffith of the Hamden Fire Department. He is describing a house in rural Ohio, a house that, from the road, looks like any other house in Vinton County. He is describing what he found inside. On the morning of June 30th, 2026, police arrived at 182 Omer Road in Hamden, Ohio to serve a warrant. They were not looking for children. They did not know children were in that house. Nobody knew. That is the only reason 16 children are still alive today. But we are going to start somewhere else. We are going to start with 16 children who grew up inside that house and disappeared from American society so completely that nobody outside those walls knew they existed. Hold on to that. The how of it is what this documentary is about. But here's what surprised a lot of people this week. One of the 4 adults charged in this case is no longer sitting in jail. Gary Siders Sr., the children's grandfather, was temporarily released after suffering a medical emergency, even as prosecutors insist the investigation is far from over and say they expect additional charges. We'll come back to why that happened. Because to understand why that decision has sparked so much reaction, you first have to understand what investigators say they found inside that house. 18 months old. That is how young the youngest child in that house was, on June 30th, 2026. At 18 months, a child is learning to walk. Learning words, the first ones, the important ones. Learning that when they reach out, someone reaches back. Learning that the world is bigger than the room they are in. These are not complicated milestones. They are the basic experiences that make a person a person. 18 years old. That is how old the oldest child in that house was. 18 is a senior year, a driver's license, a decision about college or a job or a future. 18 is the age this country considers adulthood. The 18-year-old in that house is included in the child endangerment charges because investigators say she did not appear to have the developmental capacity of an adult. 18 years old, and investigators say she still functions like a minor because she was raised like one of 16 children in a 12 by 12 foot room who had never been to school, who had never been to a doctor, who had never been outside the world those walls contained. Between those two, 18 months and 18 years, there were 14 more children, 3 sets of twins. The math adds up to a family that produced children almost every year from 2008 through 2025, ages 6 through 14. Those are the years children are supposed to be learning multiplication tables and making best friends on playgrounds and getting into trouble that teaches them something about the world. None of them had ever been to a classroom. Not one of them had ever been to school. The Vinton County Local School District issued a statement. It had no records indicating that any of the children had ever been enrolled. Not one. In any district, anywhere in Ohio. Some of the children could not speak. Some did not know their own birthdays. Some had never had a social security number. Jacqueline Yan, an associate professor at Ohio University who specializes in rural education and poverty, was asked how something like this was possible. She said, "When kids are isolated or not participating, you don't have someone who's trained to know the clues. A well check is called that for a reason. They're checking for well-being and development. Nobody had done that well check. Nobody knew they needed one. Nobody was looking for these children because nobody knew to look. And here is the detail that has stayed with every person who has covered this case. When Captain Griffith loaded the children into the ambulance, he expected fear. He expected noise, crying, screaming, the instinctive sounds a child makes when their world is turned upside down. What he got was silence, blank expressions, quiet. Children who looked at him with eyes that had no frame of reference for what was happening, because they had never been taught that the world could be different from the room where they had spent the last 4 years of their lives. They were very quiet. That is what haunts the responders most. Not the conditions, not the smell, the quiet. These children will eventually have voices. And when they do, what they say is going to change everything we think we understand about this case. Hold on to that. It is going to matter. June 30th, 2026. 10 in the morning. Investigators from the Vinton County Sheriff's Office arrived at 182 Omer Road in Hamden, Ohio. They were there to serve a search warrant. Not for children, not for a welfare check, Not because someone had called a tip line or raised a flag or reported anything about the family living in this house. Gary Siders Jr. had an outstanding warrant, 4 counts of public indecency from a charge filed in May. That warrant had been sitting there. On a Monday morning, investigators decided to serve it. Nobody told them children were inside. Nobody knew. From the road, the house at 182 Omer Road looks like a house. Visible, unremarkable. People drove past it every day. Neighbors had lived next door for 5 years. Nobody had flagged the property as concerning. On a windowsill, a bag of rice and a can of insect killer, the kind of ordinary detail you see and forget. Investigators walked to the door. They had no idea what was on the other side of it. What they found was a 1,336 square foot house. 5 rooms, 1 bathroom, 20 people living inside, and in one room, a 12 by 12 foot space, 16 children. The smell hit first. Captain Griffith would later describe it as something that stays on your clothes for hours. Something you carry home with you even after you change. A smell he had encountered before in houses with those kinds of conditions, but never like this. Children covered in urine and feces. Insects. An environment so severe that 7 children would be hospitalized and 2 would be airlifted to level 1 trauma centers.
This is pure evil. What we saw down here today is pure evil.
Wilson said later. I think if they had waited another 24 hours, there was a very high probability that we'd be dealing with a death or multiple deaths of these children. They had not waited. They had shown up for a warrant about something else entirely. Police were not looking for children. Nobody knew children were there. That warrant is the only reason these 16 children are alive. 4 adults were arrested that morning. Gary Siders Sr., 73, Christina Siders, 67, Gary Siders Jr., 36, Elizabeth Siders, 33, grandparents and parents, all 4 charged with 16 counts of felony child endangerment. All 4 pleaded not guilty. Bond set at $300,000 each. But before the charges, there is a story of how this family came to be. Court records from Mason County, West Virginia, show that Gary Siders Jr. and Elizabeth Russell were married on March 31st, 2008. Elizabeth was 15 years old. Gary was 18, a legal adult. In Ohio, the minimum marriage age is 18. In West Virginia at the time, a 15-year-old could marry with parental consent. Elizabeth's parents consented. 2 months after the wedding, Elizabeth gave birth to her first child. The math tells you she was pregnant before the marriage. 15 years old, pregnant, and married to an adult. That marriage produced 16 children over the next 17 years. Elizabeth's family says they lost track of her around age 13. Her brother Jeremy posted on Facebook the morning the story broke. My sister just wrapped her life up due to indoctrination. It is 100% real. He said he had tried to reach her, that he harassed people trying to find her. A relative named Ronnie Fletcher offered a different framing. He told reporters that Elizabeth had a difficult home life before she met Gary Jr. and that she escaped to the Siders household. That at the time, it was, in his words, a normal American home. That normal American home eventually became what investigators found on June 30th, 2026. Elizabeth's attorney, Thomas Stolley, met with her the day after her arrest. He said, "Her first question to me when I walked into the jail and introduced myself was about her kids. She asked if her children were okay. She asked if I knew where they were. She asked when she'd be able to see them again. She was crying and exhausted when he arrived. All 16 children are biologically hers." How Elizabeth Siders is characterized in this case, as a perpetrator, a co-victim, or both, is a question the investigation and eventually a jury will have to weigh. She is charged alongside her husband and his parents. She is presumed innocent, and she was a 15-year-old girl when this family began. Both of those things are true at the same time. There are 2 public conversations about Elizabeth Siders, and both of them are real. Some believe she was a 15-year-old who was groomed and isolated from her own family, and that what happened inside that house is inseparable from what happened to her first. Others believe she is an adult who had more than a decade of adulthood in which to protect 16 children, and did not. The court will eventually weigh the evidence. Until then, both conversations are happening, and both deserve to be acknowledged. When additional charges are filed, when this case moves, Crime Deepcut will be here. Subscribe so you are here when it does. Ohio Attorney General Andy Wilson held a press conference on Wednesday, July 2nd. His words: "I said yesterday that what investigators encountered was pure evil, and the evidence we've uncovered since only reinforces that assessment." He called the children almost feral. He called the conditions beyond comprehension. And then he said the sentence that tells you what the alternative would have been. "I think if they would have waited another 24 hours, there was a very high probability that we'd be dealing with a death or multiple deaths."
Most of our livestock was kept in better conditions than the children.
Vinton County Sheriff Ryan Kane stood beside him. 22 years in law enforcement. He said he had never seen human beings live in the conditions investigators found that day. His description of the room? Disgusting. He called the conditions third world. And then he said something that has stayed in the coverage since he said it. "Most of our livestock was kept in better conditions than the children." Captain Griffith gave one of the most honest accounts of what that morning felt like. He described the smell, the children's faces, the blank expressions, the quiet. He said he had entered houses with similar conditions before, but never with that many children inside. He said, "This one just kind of caught us out of surprise, because the house didn't even look like anyone was living in it." Of 16 children removed from that house, 7 were hospitalized in Columbus hospitals. 2 were airlifted to Level 1 trauma centers. 1 was in critical condition. The 18-year-old, legally an adult, was included in the charges because she did not appear to have the developmental capacity of an adult. Some of the children could not speak. Some did not know their own birthdays. Some had never been issued a Social Security number. A Dollar General employee near the house spoke to an ABC affiliate after the arrests. She said, "It was mind-blown once I saw the mugshot. I spoken to them. I just seen them on Monday. They were my last customers on Monday. She had served them. She had not known. Nobody had known." Here is the question that has dominated the coverage of this case since the morning of June 30th. How did 16 children grow up in rural Ohio without anyone noticing? Not for a month. Not for a year. For approximately 2 decades, from 2008, when Elizabeth gave birth to the first child, through 2026, when investigators opened that door. The schools did not notice because the children were never enrolled. The Vinton County Local School District has no records that any of the 16 children ever attended. In any Ohio school district, anywhere, Ohio law allows homeschooling. But the Siders family did not file homeschool notifications. They did not interact with the education system at all. The children simply did not exist on paper. The doctors did not notice because the family avoided creating a medical paper trail. No pediatrician appointments, no vaccinations, no well child visits. The neighbors did not notice because the children were kept inside. A family that had lived next door for 5 years told reporters they had never seen the children. Not once. 5 years. Next door. And they never once saw a child. No school records, no doctor visits, no vaccinations documented, no Social Security numbers for some, no neighbor who ever saw a child, no government intervention that held. For 20 years, in America, in 2026, how does this happen? Nobody knew they existed. Nobody asked why. Nobody noticed. Nobody reported it. Nobody looked. The Siders moved from county to county over approximately 20 years. Jackson County, Gallia County, Pike County, Vinton County, possibly Wisconsin. They moved, investigators now believe, specifically to avoid being caught. Every time a county might start building a record on the family, they moved, Wilson said. They were clearly bouncing around. There is one more documented fact. Investigators said that at least one county may have conducted a welfare check at some point before the family moved away. The details of that check have not been made public. If that check happened, it did not stop what followed. The house was visible from the road. Anyone could see it. Plenty of people drove past. Nobody knew what was inside. There are 2 honest ways to read the systemic failure in this case. The first, the Siders family was unusually skilled at avoiding oversight. They moved strategically. They kept children hidden. They avoided the specific interactions that would have created records. This is a story about an exceptionally determined family, not a broken system. The second, a system that can be outmaneuvered for 20 years by one family in rural Ohio is a system with structural gaps. The question of whether those gaps could be closed, and how, is one this case will force the country to address. Both readings are serious. Both have advocates. The investigation will inform which one the evidence supports. This case is in its earliest stages. Charges are expected to expand. The grand jury has not yet indicted. Subscribe. We will go through every development together. On July 7, 2026, a week after the arrests, all 4 members of the Siders family were due in court for preliminary hearings. Their attorneys and prosecutors met behind closed doors instead. The Siders waived their right to preliminary hearings. Gary Siders, SR 73, Christina Siders, 67, Gary Siders Jr., 36, Elizabeth Siders, 33, all still held on $300,000 bond each, all pleaded not guilty. Since investigators first announced these charges, one defendant, Gary Siders Sr., was temporarily released after a medical emergency and a judge modified his bond conditions. Prosecutors emphasized that the charges remain in place and that the release was related to his medical condition, not to the strength of the case. They also say the investigation is continuing and that additional charges are expected as more evidence is reviewed. The investigation is in its early stages, 68 felony counts, more to come, a grand jury that has not yet indicted, and 16 children now in foster care, learning for the first time in their lives what it is like to be in a world that knows they exist. The investigation faces a specific challenge that makes this case unlike most. The primary witnesses to what happened in that house are the 16 children themselves, and the children's communication difficulties, the developmental delays caused by years of isolation, mean that the investigation depends on testimony from people who were never given the tools to give it. Some cannot speak, some cannot write, some have no formal language at all. The people who know most about what happened in that house are the people least equipped to explain it. Hold on to this. When these children can speak, when years of therapeutic support and care give them the language, what they describe will become the core of this prosecution. That may take time. It may take years. Pastor James Demmel of the Renovate Life Church of God in Hamden spoke to what his community is doing now. He said, "We need to guard them and protect them and shelter them. Because they haven't had that, the ability to have that done in their life. They need clothing. They need food. Simple things. The things a child expects from the world. The things 16 children in a 12 by 12 room never had." Captain Griffith said he still couldn't get the smell off of him. Days after the morning of June 30th, he said he had washed his clothes. He said he had gone home and showered. The smell was still there. By the time he said that, after everything, everyone understood why. But the detail he comes back to, the detail that has stayed with every responder who was in that house that morning, is not the smell. It is the quiet. The children were so quiet, blank expressions, calm in a way that was not calm at all. They had never been taught that the world could be different from the room where they had spent most of the last 4 years. They are out of that room now. They are being cared for. They are learning language and light and the ordinary experiences that were kept from them. 16 children. The youngest is 18 months old. The oldest is 18 years. They are out of that room. And the question this documentary began with, how did 16 children disappear from American society for 20 years without anyone stopping it, is now the question an entire country is asking. Not about this family, about the systems that were supposed to find them, about the neighbors who drove past, about the schools that never enrolled them, about the doctors who never examined them, about the county officials who may have checked once and then moved on. 16 children who had never been in the world are now in the world. And the world is going to have to decide whether it failed them or whether it simply never knew. Crime Deepcut stays on this case.